The White cult was a Korean cult set up by the charismatic cult leader Jeon Yong-hee. Between the 1920s and 1930s, Korea was under Japanese control, which meant that Koreans were poor, they were desperate. It was the perfect breeding ground for a horrific cult, and Jeon Yong-hee saw his chance to become one of Korea's most gruesome cult leaders. One of the reasons why Japan held onto Korea for so long was because gold was found on the Korean peninsula. At the height of the Japanese occupation, the gold found in Korea pushed Japan to the fourth place of gold producers in the world. Japan had planned to expand into mainland China, and it had to mine as much gold as they could to finance this expensive Second Sino-Japanese War. Having enough gold would mean that they could win the war and take over large parts of the Chinese mainland. You could say that gold was on everyone's mind at that time. Finding gold would mean food on the table. Finding gold would mean you could feed your family for the day. Jeon Yong-hee knew this, and he thought of a way to use gold in a way that would make people beg to join his cult. The shrewd Jeon Yong-hee would hide gold in disused and empty gold mines. He would then gather people around the mine and tell them about his special abilities. He would then go on to discover the gold he had hid earlier, telling people it was his abilities that led him to the gold. It wasn't long before people were convinced of his mysterious, mystical abilities. People joined Jeon Yong-hee's cult in droves. But joining was not free. In order to join, you needed to offer something in return. Most families would have to donate their entire household wealth to the White cult. In case there was no wealth, Jeon Yong-hee would ask the families to donate their prettiest daughters to him and his cult. I do not have to explain to you what Jeon-hee would do to these poor girls. Anyone who did not want to offer up their household wealth or their daughter would ultimately disappear, never to be seen again. The White cult and its teachings were loosely based on Bak Do Gyo, which is a branch of Kyeondoism. Kyeondoism is a religion based on Korean Neo-Confucianism. It was Jeon Jung-yuen who created Bak Do Gyo, which was in itself a cult, in 1900. The man spent 3 years avoiding the law on Mount Kumgang, a mountain in what is now North Korea, close to the South Korean border, and the city of Sokcho. When he decided he had spent enough time on the mountain, he walked back into the nearby village and proclaimed he achieved higher learning. From here on, he tried to convince people that the world would be destroyed in June 1904, and that he, Jeon Jung-yuen, was the only one that could save them. The world obviously did not end in 1904, but he was able to gain a lot of followers fast. In fact, he cheated most of his followers out of money, and was able to amass no less than 60 concubines. It is believed that between 1915 and 1916, he had around 10,000 followers. The man died in 1919 and left 3 sons. All 3 of the men wanted to take over the cult. As there was no resolution, they decided to each go their own way. One of these sons was Jeon Yong-hee. The teachings of the Bak Gyo cult revolved around the belief that one man would make the heavens pure again. This man was Jeon Yong-hee. He created Bak Gyo in 1923. Although he was uneducated, he was very charismatic and a master manipulator. He was very good at reading people. We find a lot of evidence on this in the testimonies of the people that were able to flee this cult. When someone would even as much look at him in a wrong way, he would berate them. In fact, he was so good at reading people that many believed he could read minds. Another fact that was unearthed in the testimonies was that nobody knows what he looks like. Jeon Yong-hee would always cover up his face. He claimed that ordinary people such as his cult followers were unable to look upon his power. Even his wives were forbidden to look upon his face. Very few people knew what he looked like. Jeon also told his followers that he was in fact a son of God. He would talk about how they would drive away the Japanese oppressors once they had amassed enough spiritual power. He also foretold the end of the world and told his followers that he was the only one that could lead them to salvation. His teachings told of how the West would be in flames, while the East would know great floods. He had built more than 53 safe houses across the Korean peninsula, and promised his followers that he would lead them to these safe houses on the final day. They were the only people who would survive this cosmic event. They just had to follow him and his teachings. And of course give him all of their wealth, or their prettiest daughter. The worst thing about all of this, people actually believed him. The sad truth is that the followers of this cult were mostly poor farmers, de labourers with hardly anything to their name. At the time, the Korean population was 70% to 80% illiterate, which often meant they were under or even uneducated. Jeon built a secret police of loyal followers who had to look for the naive rich. He would then try to sweet talk and manipulate these people into joining his cult. Another task of the secret police was to find poor families with very beautiful daughters. Jeon was known to partake in God's ceremonies with the girls, about which I will not go into full detail. When he would grow tired of one of the girls, he would give her to one of his loyalists. It wasn't too long, however, before people started to lose their patience. These poor farmers that had given Jeon their daughters kept being poor with hardly enough to feed their family. And the end of the world did not seem to manifest. The farmers started to realize that Jeon had lied to them, which led to a small uprising. To quash this resistance, Jeon had formed a small squad with some of his most loyal followers, most of them teenagers, that would observe the other members of the cult and tell on them. Jeon would then tell his inner circle to go and pray with the members that were told upon, which is an euphemism for taking them out somewhere in the woods. If the individual was part of a family, the whole family had to go and pray in the woods. The Japanese police were finally able to come down on Jeon Yong-hee and his cult. It had come to light that Jeon Yong-hee had buried 4 of his wives on his properties, and was the suspect in a slew of other crimes. Sadly, Jeon managed to escape, after which Thai Japanese police closed the case. It is still unclear what caused Jeon to go off the rails, but it is speculated that his escape and the closing of the case had meant he felt untouchable. He started recruiting members at an astonishing rate, and when he grew tired of one of his wives, if a wife got pregnant, if a wife got resistant, he would bury her on his property. If he grew tired of feeding his cult followers, or if he felt they were hurting him financially, the whole family would end up in a mass grave. This went on for a couple of years. Any time he felt the police was on his heels, he would kill all his followers and move on. The downfall of Jeon did not come until 1937, when Yoo Geun-young tried to mend the relationship with his family. His family had fallen prey to the cult, and his wealthy grandfather, a pharmacist, had donated all his money to the white cult. In fact, the grandfather had donated all of the money, the pharmacy, and even the land to the cult because he thought the money would come back to his son and grandson in hundredfold. Yoo's father was an ardent believer in the cult and made no effort to reclaim the money. In fact, he even got Yoo's sister involved as Jeon's concubine. Yoo tried to convince his family to flee, to leave the cult. They wouldn't. In the end, Yoo tried to mend the relationship with his family by visiting them in the cult. He got an audience with his brother-in-law, Jeon Yong-hee. Jeon Yong-hee asked Yoo to give up his life and move to Seoul. When Yoo refused, Jeon leapt at him with a knife, trying to kill him. Yoo, younger and physically stronger than Jeon Yong-hee, was able to escape and ran to the local police precinct for sanctuary. When the police realized that they did not stop the Jeon family cult in 1930, they sped to the scene. By the time the police arrived at the camp, Jeon had fled. The only thing the police could do was arrest some of the high-ranking members of the cult that stayed behind. It is believed that Jeon killed more than 400 people, all over the Korean peninsula, of which only 158 were identified. Some of the bodies were even found in the heart of Seoul, and the gold mine we started our story with. That same year, police found Jeon on Yongmun Mountain. In its pockets they found Jeon's gold watch and some money. The face of Jaune was eaten at by animals. Cause of death: suicide. It is hard to know what happened next, as the Second World War was coming to a close. There are no records of executions, and it is believed that when the Korean peninsula was liberated from the Japanese, prisoners were released, after which they